My daughter was fighting for her life in intensive care while her husband laughed on a yacht, raising champagne glasses bought with my money. $15,000 gone in one night, and my little girl couldn't even get the medicine she needed. The shock nearly crushed me, but I wasn't done yet. Within hours, he would learn that I could still take back everything he stole. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from in the comments. I sat alone in the living room that had carried my life through so many seasons, the Texas sun pouring through half-closed blinds and casting long golden stripes across the wooden floor. This house had stood with me for decades, and every corner whispered something familiar. My wife Linda's photograph smiled down from the mantel, her eyes as steady and gentle as the day I married her. Beside it rested the wooden rocking chair I had carved with my own hands, years ago, when my back was stronger and my heart still believed in simple permanence. That chair creaked whenever I sat in it, like an old friend reminding me of my own age. Tonight I sank into it, with the weight of betrayal pressing down harder than any lumber or steel I had ever lifted. I thought back to the sacrifices, the long line of checks I had written without complaint, the hours of overtime I had worked just so my daughter Rachel could step into adulthood with dignity. I remembered writing out the last of those tuition payments, $60,000 in all, so she could graduate without a mountain of debt on her shoulders. That was what a father was supposed to do, wasn't it? To build a bridge strong enough for his child to walk across. Later, when Rachel told me she and Brian wanted to marry, I opened another corner of my heart and of my bank account. I signed the check for a $25,000 car so that they could begin life together, not in debt, but in motion, rolling forward into a future I thought they deserved. I remember Brian shaking my hand and saying, "You won't regret this, sir." And I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. Now I looked at those memories differently. Every dollar, every sacrifice, every act of generosity that had once tasted of pride now tasted of ashes. What was once love had been twisted into leverage. What was once security had become a knife at my throat. I had trusted Brian with the keys to our financial safety net. More than $200,000 sat in that account. I told myself it was to help the family. He assured me it was only for emergencies. "Rachel doesn't need to worry about money," he said. "Let me take care of it." I nodded then, thinking myself wise, thinking that trust was a sign of strength. Now I saw it for what it was, the first brick in the wall of betrayal. The bank statements lay on the coffee table in front of me, their edges catching the amber light of the lamp like thin blades. I traced my finger over the embossed seal, the neat lines of numbers that once represented security. Now those same numbers mocked me, proof that while Rachel fought for her life, Brian siphoned joy from accounts he never earned. The yellow glow of the lamp spread across the paper, and in its reflection I saw my own face, older, wearier, shadowed with something that wasn't just grief anymore. It was anger rising from the ground of my soul. I tried to shake the memories, but they rushed back with cruel insistence. The phone call from Rachel 3 months ago, when she whispered, "I'm just tired, Dad, really tired." I had smiled gently into the receiver, thinking she meant work deadlines, long nights with the kids. I told her to rest, to take it easy, to let Brian carry more of the load. My chest tightened as I realized how blind I had been. She was not simply tired, she was dying, and I hadn't seen it. She had carried that burden alone. And while she carried silence, Brian carried my money straight into his own pockets. The betrayal was not only financial, it was human, it was moral. My daughter had chosen silence. She did not want to burden me because she thought her father had already carried too much grief after Linda passed. But Brian used that silence as a cloak, a cover for his own indulgence. He dared to sip champagne while his wife lay under fluorescent lights, tubes in her veins. That kind of cruelty could not be measured in dollars. It was measured in heartbreak, in the cracks spreading through a family that once had trust at its center. The transition inside me was slow at first. At the beginning, shock held me frozen, like a deer in the blinding headlights of reality. But the more I stared at those papers, the more I replayed Rachel's weak voice in my ear, the more something else began to stir. It was as if grief had burned itself out and left behind a coal that glowed hotter with every memory. I whispered aloud to no one and to everyone. I let that man hold the keys to our future. I gave him the lock and the combination, and he used it to steal what mattered most. The words tasted bitter, but in them was a strange kind of clarity. For the first time in weeks, I felt my back straighten. My eyes drifted to Linda's picture on the mantel, her smile soft, her hand forever caught in the loop of a dance at our anniversary party. I stared at her eyes until the silence of the room thickened around me. "Linda," I whispered, voice breaking, "what would you do if you were here? Would you tell me to fight or to forgive? Would you tell me to close my eyes or open them wider?" I leaned forward, pressing my elbows to my knees, hands trembling. "I've let Rachel suffer too much. I can't let her down anymore. I can't let you down." For a moment, the loneliness of the room pressed so heavily that I felt swallowed whole. Then, just as quickly, the loneliness hardened into resolve. The chair creaked as I stood, moving slowly to the drawer where I kept the old files. Dust clung to the metal handle. I slid it open and pulled out the thick folder marked Bank and Insurance. Inside, yellowing papers still carried the smell of ink and time. My fingers brushed over the life insurance policy Linda and I had signed together. Beneath it lay the bank records, the original deeds, the documents of a lifetime. The weight of those papers was more than physical. It was the weight of control, the weight of proof, the weight of action waiting to be taken. I spread them across the table, the papers glowing under the lamplight, like maps leading me forward. As I stared down at the documents, I realized something important. Brian thought I was weak, a grieving old man, too lost in memory to notice the theft under his nose. He thought the silence of my daughter would cover his indulgence, that my love for Rachel would blind me forever. But he had underestimated me. He had underestimated what a father becomes when his family is threatened. "They think I'm finished," I muttered, the sound strange in the empty room. But the game has only just begun. The house seemed to shift with me, the walls leaning in as if to listen. The worn couch where Rachel once sat with homework papers scattered across her lap. The corner table where Ethan stacked toy cars in precarious towers. The kitchen where Sophie baked cookies last Christmas, spilling flour across the floor while Linda would have laughed. Every corner reminded me of what was at stake. This wasn't just about numbers on a ledger or a car parked in someone else's driveway. It was about home. It was about memory. It was about the family Linda and I had built brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. I closed my eyes and could still see the hardwood floors I had laid myself one long summer, each board hammered into place with calloused hands. Those boards had carried Rachel across the room in her graduation gown, had heard the patter of my grandchildren's feet as they learned to walk. And now those same floors carried only my footsteps, heavy with the knowledge of betrayal. The house itself seemed to ache with me. I reached for the photograph of Linda again, whispering, "I will not let him take this from us. Not the money, not the house, not the future. He will not have the last word." The night deepened outside the window, shadows stretching longer as I gathered the papers into a neat stack. My hands no longer shook. Instead, they moved with precision, as if muscle memory had returned from my years as an engineer, when every detail mattered, when every bolt had to fit just right, or the whole structure would collapse. I had been trained to solve problems, and this was the greatest problem of my life. Brian had gambled on my weakness. He would discover soon enough that he had calculated wrong. I pressed my palm flat on the folder, feeling the cool texture of paper beneath my skin. A small, grim smile tugged at my mouth. I was no longer only a grieving husband or a wounded father. I was a man with evidence, a man with reason, a man with fire enough to burn through every falsehood Brian had built. and as the silence of the room pressed close, I whispered again, "Linda, watch me now. I'm going to fight." The lamp flickered slightly, the paper edges shimmering in the golden light. I slid the documents back into the folder and closed the drawer gently, almost reverently. It wasn't just a drawer anymore. It was a vault. It was the line where grief ended and action began. Tomorrow, the phone calls would start. Tomorrow, the meetings, the signatures, the locks slammed shut on accounts Brian thought he owned. Tonight, though, in this house filled with memories, I allowed myself one more moment of stillness. The game had begun, yes, but so had my resolve. He thought he had taken everything. He thought wrong. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment one below to let me know you're here with me. I woke before dawn to a room that felt like it had been holding its breath all night. The lamp on the end table was still on from the hours I spent reading statements and insurance papers, and the yellow shade threw a soft halo across the living room like a low sun. My coffee maker gurgled in the kitchen. Outside, the big oak brushed the window with a sound like a quiet broom. I sat up slowly, steadied my hands on my knees, and told myself the time for staring at memories had passed. Action. That single word steadied me. I dialed Mr. Anderson while the kettle clicked off. His number has lived in my phone for 20 years, the lawyer who drew up my will and the trust Linda and I built back when we believed the future could be signed for. When his sleepy voice answered, I apologized for the hour. He told me not to worry, that old clients with emergencies had earned the right to wake him early. I laid everything out. My daughter, Rachel, is in intensive care. My son-in-law, Brian, is treating my money like a trophy cabinet. Yacht rental, Mercedes service, rodeo drive. The kind of list that turns a father's stomach. He cleared his throat and went straight to business. Freeze access, he said. Audit everything. He asked whether Brian had ever been made a co-owner or only an authorized user. Authorized user, I told him. I heard his relief and his anger in the same breath. That would make this cleaner. He outlined the steps, steady and professional. He would draft a directive and a revocation of privileges for every account with his name attached. I should gather statements, identify suspicious transactions, and prepare to document every conversation from this moment on. I put him on speaker, spread the papers across the dining table, and read the numbers he needed. The account ending in 3412 carried most of my savings. The account ending in 9721 was the just-in-case account I had opened years ago. He paused when I listed the charges that had turned my stomach to stone. $14,800 to a yacht charter company out of Marina del Rey. $2,200 to a Mercedes service center in Beverly Hills. $3,000 to a boutique on Rodeo Drive. He sighed, not surprised, only disappointed for me. Mr. Anderson asked me to photograph each page of the statements and email them immediately. Paper speaks, he said, and the court listens better when paper has dates. I used my phone to capture every page, making sure the totals and dates were clear. He asked me to write down any conversations where Brian framed expenses as family needs. I remembered him asking months ago if he could streamline the bills so Rachel would not worry. Memory stains differently when the truth arrives. He set an appointment for mid-morning at his office. I placed the papers in a leather folder, the same one I used when Linda and I refinanced the house, and felt the familiar weight against my palm. I took a breath that filled my ribs. Then I drove to the hospital because I needed to see my daughter's face before I did anything else. The sunrise was thin and pink, a fragile ribbon stretched over the freeway. In the elevator to the 7th floor, I watched the numbers climb and tried to hold my heart still. The antiseptic smell met me at the doors. Monitors chirped, shoes squeaked. I sanitized my hands, pushed open Rachel's door with a gentle knock, and stepped inside. Her face was paler than yesterday, but her eyes brightened when she saw me. I kissed her forehead and took her hand, careful of the tape and the lines. We sat in quiet for a few minutes, breathing together, letting the room slow down. A nurse came in to check the bags. She was the same nurse from last night, the one with careful hands and kind eyes. When she adjusted the line, I asked softly whether the medication schedule had changed. Her mouth tightened. She looked at Rachel, then back at me, measuring how much truth I could carry. Some doses had been delayed, she said. The insurance had lapsed for a few weeks. There had been calls and appeals. The hospital had pushed what it could through charity channels, but there had been gaps they couldn't close. Her voice was apologetic, but the apology wasn't hers to give. After the nurse left, Rachel turned her head toward the window. Her voice was faint, dry from too much air and too little sleep. She told me Brian had said the meds were too expensive. He told her to be tough, to ride it out. "You can handle this," he said, as if chemotherapy were a stubborn head cold. Hearing those words stumble out of my daughter made something inside me go very still. I squeezed her fingers and told her I loved her, that she never had to explain another thing to me again, not one word more. In the hallway, I stared out the long window at the city waking up in squares and lines. My reflection looked different in the glass, older, yes, but also set. I took a photo of the clock on the wall. Timestamps matter. Then I texted Mr. Anderson and told him I was on my way. On the walk to the garage, my phone buzzed with a bank alert. A pending charge had been declined. Brian was trying to buy something at a marina restaurant. The amount was small compared to the yacht, but it felt like the world had noticed what I was doing and nodded. Mr. Anderson's office sits in a single-story brick building that smells like lemon oil and old books. The receptionist, who has known me since Linda's funeral, touched my arm and said I looked tired. Tired felt like too small a word. He ushered me into his office and closed the door, permitting me to talk fast. He listened without interrupting, pen moving across a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he slid a stack of documents toward me, each marked with small blue tabs. Directive to financial institutions, revocation of authorization, notice of restricted access. The stack looked like a dam. I signed where he pointed and initialed where the tabs told me to. My name on that paper steadied me more than coffee ever could. He called the bank on speaker, introduced himself, and asked for the legal department. When his contact came on the line, the tone changed. The words were clean, no begging, just facts, account numbers, dates. The representative confirmed Brian's status as an authorized user and said the revocations would be processed immediately upon receipt of our documents. Mr. Anderson emailed the scans while we remained on the call. The representative came back on and confirmed receipt. She read the balances. She acknowledged the instruction to freeze $120,000 in the backup account and to require my in-person authorization for any future movement. She asked whether I wanted alerts for attempted transactions. Yes, I said. Send them all. Mr. Anderson thanked her, then thanked me for moving quickly. Speed is its own kind of mercy, he said, for you and for Rachel. I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot I had not known I was holding. Mr. Anderson tapped the legal pad and told me to keep building the record. Every social media post, every declined charge, every statement from hospital staff. He reminded me that judges see hundreds of family cases and that the ones with clean timelines stand tallest. He looked at the photograph of Linda on my phone and said my wife would be proud of this steadiness. Pride is a word I had not allowed myself to touch. For a second, I did. When I left his office, the air outside felt sharper, as if the day had new edges. I drove straight to the bank to verify in person. The branch manager met me in a small glass office, her hands folded on a pad of forms. She had already read Mr. Anderson's directive. She pulled up my accounts and turned the monitor toward me so I could see the freeze notes beside the balances. The number, $120,000, looked like a lifeboat finally tied to a dock. She asked if any automatic payments should be preserved. I kept my voice level and said to leave only the property tax. Everything else could wait. In the parking lot, I stood in the sun with the folder under my arm and let the heat soak into my shoulders. The sky looked washed, as if rain had thought about visiting and decided against it. I thumbed my phone awake and scrolled to Brian's contact. The message thread was a handful of logistics, and then my last unanswered texts. I dialed anyway. Voicemail after one ring. I kept my message short, my voice even, no wasted air. Brian, this is Frank. Access is revoked. Do not attempt further charges. Call me if you have something responsible to say. I ended the call before anger could burn my mouth. I drove back to the hospital because I needed to see Rachel to remind myself why each step mattered. I bought a tea I did not want from the kiosk and carried the paper cup for warmth. She was sleeping when I arrived. Her face looked less strained, maybe the steroids, maybe the prayers of a tired father. I sat and watched the monitor numbers rise and fall like slow tides. I thought about money not as digits, but as effort. Every dollar had once been a Saturday I gave up, or a backache I accepted, and he had thrown those hours into the ocean to watch them glitter for a minute in the sun. The nurse returned with a chart. I asked her gently to note the delays we had discussed earlier, not to assign blame, but to keep a record. She nodded, wrote carefully, and patted my arm. She said Rachel's labs looked a touch better. I thanked her for that small light. When she left, I took Linda's locket from my pocket, the small gold oval I kept when we boxed her things, and pressed it in my palm like a promise. "I'm doing it, Linda," I whispered. "I'm doing what you would have done." I spent the afternoon building the rest of the file. I took screenshots of Brian's yacht photos, the ones where he wore sunglasses that cost more than a week of groceries. I copied the caption he had written about living his best life. I saved the timestamp and the location tag. I pulled the bank app and added the declined charge from the Marina restaurant, then wrote a note about the time of day. I built a simple spreadsheet and entered each suspicious transaction with the date and the vendor. $1,400 to $800 yacht rental, $20,200 Mercedes service, $3,000 at Rodeo Drive, and a series of smaller hits that added up like hail. When I finished, I called Mr. Anderson and read the list aloud. He asked whether I had noticed patterns. There were clusters around Fridays, like he celebrated a week of not visiting his wife with a charge or 3. Mr. Anderson asked me gently whether I was ready for the pushback. People like Brian often bluff loudly when the money stops. Threats, accusations, rewriting history until cruelty sounds like necessity. I told him I understood. "He thinks I'm just a grieving old man," I said, steady now. "But he's about to learn how wrong he is." Evening pulled its long shadows across the floor when I stepped outside for air. I leaned against the brick and watched the parking lot fill and empty, a tide that never rests. I practiced what I would say if Brian actually called back. I would not shout. I would not let my voice break. I would say the truth plainly. He had taken money meant for family stability and blown it on spectacle. He had told his sick wife to endure because medicine was expensive. He had treated our grandchildren's future like loose cash. Saying it in my head made it easier to keep the anger from running the whole show. I kissed Rachel's forehead and told her I would be back after errands. She squeezed my hand, a fragile pressure that said more than speech. In the car, the dashboard clock blinked 6:15. I drove to a copy shop that stayed open late and printed 2 sets of everything: statements, screenshots, the spreadsheet, and the bank confirmations. I bought a heavy red folder because red demands attention. I labeled it with a black marker. Record. The clerk asked whether I needed anything else. I said I needed good luck. He smiled, the sympathetic smile people give when they know nothing they say can fix a thing. Back at the house, I spread the copies on the dining table like maps, finally making sense. I opened my notebook and drafted a timeline starting with the day Rachel whispered that she felt tired and ending with the declined charge at the marina. I wrote in short sentences so I could hear how it would sound in a room where decisions are made. I included exact numbers because numbers do not tremble. 14,800, 2,200, 3,000, 120,000 saved. I added the insurance lapse and the delayed meds. I wrote the nurse's name carefully so I would not forget. My phone lit up with a text from an unknown number, a photo of a bar stool, a hand holding a metal card, the caption, "This you?" He was angry enough to taunt. I did not reply. I saved it. Evidence sometimes wears cheap cologne. Minutes later, another message arrived, this one pretending calm. "We need to talk like adults," he wrote. "You're overreacting. Rachel would not want this." I took a breath and reminded myself that manipulation often borrows the voice of love. I typed one sentence and hit send. "The days of you spending my money are over." Crickets began their simple song outside the kitchen window. I made a sandwich, barely tasted it, and ate it standing up. I washed the plate and set it in the rack because order is its own prayer. Then I placed the red folder into my leather briefcase, the same one I carried to job sites when I still wore a hard hat and a name badge. I added a fresh pen, my ID, and a copy of the life insurance policy Linda and I signed in a summer when the light lasted forever. I did not need the policy today. I needed the reassurance of paper and ink that once kept promises and could keep them again. That night, I also changed every password I owned and turned on two-factor authentication for the bank, the email, and even the cloud account where I kept family photos. I printed a list of customer service numbers and taped it inside the red folder so I would not fumble if a call came at a bad hour. I wrote down the names of every person I spoke to and the time we talked. Small steps, maybe, but each one felt like a lock clicking into place. Control returns in inches before it arrives in miles. It helped. Before bed, I stood at the window and watched a neighbor walk his dog under the street lamp. Ordinary life kept going, that faithful march of evening errands and quiet porches. Brian liked to perform ordinary life online, staging moments for applause. A man can trick a screen, but he cannot trick a ledger, and he cannot trick time. I whispered to Linda that I would carry this through to the end. I would stay measured. I would not waste the strength I needed on shouting. I closed the curtains and slept with the briefcase resting against the closet door like a guard. Morning came back without apology. I showered, shaved, and dressed in the navy blazer Linda used to say made me look like I still had a purpose. At the hospital, I met briefly with the billing coordinator and asked her to flag Rachel's account for direct payment from me whenever the insurance lagged. She thanked me and explained which invoices were current and which were pending. I wrote the amounts in my notebook and promised to cover what was necessary until the reauthorization was complete. The numbers mattered, but the promise mattered more. From there, I drove to Mr. Anderson's office to sign the final versions of the directives. He had added a clause allowing us to notify credit bureaus of the revoked access, a small guardrail so Brian could not open something new in the fog of his panic. The scanner hummed. The notary stamped. I pressed the pen to the last line of the last page and wrote my name, slow and legible. It was not the signature of a man surrendering. It was the signature of a man taking back the keys to his house. When we finished, Mr. Anderson pushed a glass of water across the desk and told me it was time to breathe. He laid out the next steps: document service of notice if needed, prepare for emergency motions if Brian escalated, keep our attention on Rachel's care. He asked if I wanted to rehearse what I would say if Brian tried to flip the narrative. I spoke the truth in a calm voice. He nodded. Then he shook my hand with the steady grip of a man who believes in the usefulness of patience. I walked out into the late morning, the sun already high, and slid the signed copies into my briefcase. I stopped on the sidewalk, set the case on a bench, and pressed my palms against the leather. I looked up at the blue Texas sky until my eyes watered. Then I whispered it so only I could hear. Tomorrow, everything will change. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 2 below to let me know you're here with me. I woke to the smell of coffee and paper, a strange blend that had become the scent of this fight. The red folder sat where I left it, square on the dining table, the corners aligned like a soldier at attention. Inside were the copies Mr. Anderson prepared, the signed directives, the email printouts from the bank, and the notes I wrote by hand so I would remember what mattered when voices got loud. $120,000 was frozen and safe. The rest, what he had already burned, lived in ink and screenshots. I poured coffee, stood by the sink, and told myself to keep my voice steady no matter what came. I felt ready, more ready than yesterday. By 8, I was on the road, the briefcase riding shotgun like an old partner. The hospital lot was half empty. I took the long way in so I could walk off some of the heat in my chest. Rachel was awake when I reached her room. Her face looked a shade brighter, which can mean a lot or a little in a place like this. I brushed her hair back with my fingers and told her I would be gone for a stretch, that I had to sign and deliver, that I would be reachable the whole time. She squeezed my hand with a tired smile. The nurse adjusted the line and said the morning meds were on time. That sentence landed like sunlight. I kissed Rachel's forehead and let the door fall shut behind me. At 9, I sat across from Mr. Anderson under the slow hum of his office vent. He wore the same blue tie as yesterday and a face that said he had slept about as well as I had. He pushed a neat stack toward me. Each letter was addressed and dated, each page footnoted with the statute that carried it. He reviewed the plan like a coach who understands the fourth quarter is not a place for improvisation. File the notices, confirm receipt, speak to the bank's legal desk on the record, and build the log line by line. He reminded me to write down times and names, to keep my tone calm, and to let paper do what shouting cannot. I signed where the tabs told me to sign. He scanned while we talked. The scanner's soft whir felt like a metronome for taking back control. I stepped out to the parking lot to call the bank myself. The manager recognized my name and told me the freeze stood, that attempted charges would trigger alerts, and that in-person withdrawals required me and only me. She spoke like someone who had seen 100 versions of this story and still cared enough to be careful. When I hung up, the phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I answered because I knew exactly who it was. Music and wind spilled through the speaker. Brian did not say hello. He started with a complaint, with a wounded pride, with words about a card being declined in front of friends. He said I had embarrassed him. He said I had made him look small. I let him run until the steam burned off. Then I told him a simple truth. The money was mine. The access was a favor. The favor had ended. He laughed in a way that had no humor in it and called me cruel. He said Rachel would be ashamed of me. I told him Rachel's shame had nothing to do with me and everything to do with how he chose to spend while she lay under hospital lights. He shifted fast, from anger to need. He said he was stuck at sea and needed a small transfer to get back to shore. He said this would all be cleared up once we talked in person. He said there had been misunderstandings. I kept my voice low. No, I said. No? He did not like that word. He called it petty. I let silence answer him. Then I told him what I printed at 2 a.m. I had found the $5,000 withdrawal from Sophie and Ethan's college fund, the one I built $10 and $20 at a time, the one with their names written in careful ink on the folder. He called it temporary. I told him that nothing about their future was temporary to me. He tried a different angle. He said he would take the kids. He said he would tell a judge that I was unstable, that I had turned Rachel against him, that my grief made me unfit to manage anything important. I looked at the sunlight flashing on my windshield and spoke as evenly as I could. Try it, I said. Bring your story. I will bring the numbers. $14,800 for a yacht charter, $2,200 to a Mercedes service center, $3,000 on Rodeo Drive, $5,000 from the children. I told him his receipts were a map, and the destination was not the truth he kept repeating. He called me heartless and hung up. I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel until the heat of the plastic calmed me down. I went back inside to Mr. Anderson and told him the highlights. He did not raise his voice or his eyebrows. He simply added a line to the log about the threat regarding custody and the words I used in response. He asked whether I wanted to proceed with protective orders over the remaining family accounts and the children's funds. Yes, I said. He drafted quickly, speaking the clauses out loud as he typed so I could hear the sense of them. No withdrawals without my written consent. No changes of beneficiaries, no opening of new credit using my information. He printed the motions and slid them across the desk. My pen felt heavier in my hand, not with dread, but with purpose. The bank called back just before lunch to report 2 attempted cash advances and a declined restaurant transaction at a marina. The manager's tone stayed professional, but I could hear the human heartbeat under it. I thanked her again and asked for copies of the alerts for my file. She sent them while we were still on the call. Mr. Anderson printed them while the paper was still warm. Fax had a way of arriving in bunches once you invited them. I ate a sandwich in the truck and watched a pair of sparrows fight over a crust of bread in the lot. People passed me carrying takeout and tall drinks, moving through a day that would never know my daughter's name or the shape of her pain. For a moment, I let envy rise. Then I let it go. I had a job to do, and that job did not include wishing for another life. I drove to the branch and had the manager print the account notations again with today's timestamp. I shook her hand and said I appreciated the way she spoke to me. Sometimes the kindness of a stranger lives in a small sentence you can carry for a long time. At 2, the phone rang again. Same number, same lesson waiting inside it. There was no music this time, only a lot of air and a voice that sounded smaller. He said he could not pay the marina. He said his friends had left. He said a cab would not take him without a card to put on file. He asked for a short favor. He said dignity like it was a coupon. I pictured Rachel's hand under mine in the hospital and told him I would not fund one more minute of his pride. He snapped and called me a monster. He said I wanted to see him suffer. I told him he was speaking about himself. He had wanted to see himself shine. He asked what I expected him to do. I said I expected him to think about his wife and his children first. He tried to pull me into an argument I would not have. I ended the call and texted Mr. Anderson that the storm would likely move to land soon. He replied with one sentence. Keep your timeline clean. Documentation would be my armor today. I drove to the hospital because I wanted to anchor the day to something good. Rachel slept when I arrived. The room was dim, the hallway quiet, the machine lights blinking like lazy fireflies. I sat and listened to the slow rhythm of her breathing and reminded myself why every document mattered. A nurse came in to chart vitals and told me the new schedule for meds had been held, that billing had confirmed my direct payment authorization. I thanked her and asked her name again so I could write it properly in my notes. She smiled and spelled it. In the evening, Mr. Anderson called to say he had filed the protective orders and that a judge would review them in the morning. He asked if I felt up to serving notice on Brian at the apartment with a process server. I said I would go. I did not want a scene, but I wanted the truth delivered by a hand that could testify if needed. We met the server in the parking lot at dusk. The pool smelled like chlorine. The walkways smelled like cigarettes. The server checked the buzzer list and pressed the button. A voice answered, sharp and suspicious. The server identified himself and stated he had documents. The door clicked open. Brian opened the door shirtless, then stepped back to throw on a wrinkled polo like respect was something he could pull over his head. He looked surprised and then angry. He looked down the hall to see who might be watching. The server held out the packet and stated the date and time. Brian took it like a man receiving a bill he did not plan to pay. He tried to hand it back. The server said service was complete and turned to leave. That is when Brian pointed at me and started his speech. He said I was ruining his good name. He said I had frozen accounts that did not belong to me. He said he had been taking care of business while I sat at home and watched old movies. He swore he would take me to court and expose me as a bitter old man. I let him talk until he wound down, then told him quietly that the bank records spoke better than I ever could. I told him that the yacht invoice, the car service, the designer charges, and the $5,000 from the college fund built a choir no judge would ignore. He laughed once, short and bitter, and closed the door hard enough to rattle the glass. The next morning, the courthouse smelled like old wood and floor polish, a scent that reminds me justice takes time. Mr. Anderson and I sat on a bench outside the hearing room while a clerk stamped papers on a counter, nicked by 1,000 watches. When our case number was called, we stood at the small podium and placed the record on the table. The judge read quickly, then slowly, then lifted his eyes. He asked Mr. Anderson to summarize. My lawyer spoke in simple words. Sole ownership, authorized user, revocation served, attempted charges after notice, $14,800 yacht rental, $20,200 service, $3,000 luxury goods, $5,000 taken from the children's fund, and an ICU room where the husband did not visit. He handed up the hospital note about the lapse and the delayed meds. The room listened. The facts carried their own weather. Brian arrived late, hair wet, shoes untied. He took a seat in the back row and bounced his knee like a piston. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he launched into a speech about loyalty and stress and networking. He said the yacht was business, the car was maintenance, Rodeo Drive was a gift for a client, and the college withdrawal was a temporary loan. The judge held up a hand and asked for receipts. Mr. Anderson handed up the bank statements and the screenshot. The judge read the timestamps and let the silence work. Mr. Anderson rose and read the bank's confirmations of the attempted charges after notice. He read the note from the hospital about the insurance lapse and the delayed meds in the weeks when the spending surged. He showed the screenshot of the yacht photo with the timestamp and the location tag. The judge leaned forward, elbows on the bench, and asked me one question. Did you authorize the withdrawal from the children's fund? No, I said. The word sounded like a gavel. The judge nodded once and spoke with the clarity of a bell. Orders granted. Protective measures extended. Any further attempt to access funds would invite sanctions. He asked the clerk to prepare the written order. The clerk's stamp made a sound that felt like a door closing the right way. Brian stood and tried to speak again without permission. The bailiff's eyes were enough to quiet him. He left ahead of us, pushing the heavy door like it had insulted him. On the steps outside, he waited with folded arms and a face that was trying to decide between tears and rage. He told me I would regret this. I told him I already regretted trusting him. He said I had made him look like a joke to his friends. I told him a joke, and he told the truth. Mr. Anderson put a hand on my elbow and steered me toward the car, the way you guide someone away from a storm that no longer concerns you. I drove to the hospital with the order in my jacket pocket like a heartbeat. Rachel was dozing when I arrived. I sat and read the order aloud in a quiet voice, the way a person reads scripture to someone almost asleep. I read the lines about the college fund and felt heat behind my eyes. I did not bother to hide. She stirred and whispered that she loved me. I told her I loved her more. The nurse stepped in and adjusted a line and winked, a small mercy inside all the machines. That night I ate dinner at the kitchen counter, standing the way men do when they do not want to get comfortable in a chair. I opened the red folder and slid the judge's order into a sleeve, the way librarians slide treasures behind glass. I wrote the date and the time, and the phrase orders granted on my timeline. I added a line under it, children protected. Children. I closed the folder and put it in the briefcase, then placed the briefcase by the front door so I wouldn't trip over it in the morning. Habit makes sure the important things stay in front of you. My phone buzzed with a final message from Brian. He wrote that he had no way to get from the marina to his place. He asked for just enough to cover the ride. He said he would pay me back when things calmed down. I stared at the screen until my reflection looked back like a ghost. I typed what needed to be typed. You chose champagne instead of family. Live with your choice. I stepped onto the porch and let the Texas night settle on my shoulders. The cicadas were loud. The air carried the last of the day's heat like a hand that would not let go. I thought about Linda and the patience she taught me. I thought about the day Rachel was born and the way I promised to stand between her and anything that stole her peace. The old ache of being dismissed rose, then faded. Tonight, the court had seen us. I sat on the top step and watched the street lights turn the road into slices of gold. Somewhere down the block, a neighbor laughed. Inside, the ice maker dropped a few cubes like a small avalanche. I replayed the day in order. The call on the boat, the $5,000 from the college fund. The orders were signed and stamped. The judge's voice when he said sanctions. The way Rachel's face softened. A door inside me clicked shut. I knew this was not the end. There would be more forms, more visits, more words that tried to pick at me like crows. But the tilt of the landscape had changed. He would not move money in the dark. He would not sell a bright story to a clerk who had the facts. He would not pluck the future from two small children and call it a loan. Not anymore. The law had put its hand on the scale. The weight favored the quiet, patient work of a father who had run out of patience for lies. I went back inside and turned off the lamp. And turned. The room looked different in the dark, less haunted, more ordinary. I stood under Linda's picture and whispered what I always whisper when I begin hard things and when I finish them. Watch over her. Watch over them. Watch over me while I do the next right thing. I locked the door and moved the briefcase from the hallway to the chair. Companion, not guard. Before I slept, I wrote one more sentence at the bottom of the timeline. They thought I was weak. Now they know the cost of that mistake. I closed the notebook, set it on the red folder, and lay down with the phone where I could reach it without fumbling. The dark did what it does best. It made the noise small. It made the next day close. Feeling unseen and unfairly treated is heavy, isn't it? If you believe everyone deserves justice and to be recognized as worthy, comment justice. Say it so you can hear yourself. Together, now watch what we do next and see how this pain becomes proof that holds. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 3 below to let me know you're here with me. I woke to a quiet house, the kind of quiet that does not sting anymore but simply rests on your shoulders like a blanket. The red folder still sat on the corner of the dining table, now fat with stamped orders and copies of everything I had gathered over the last months. The weight of it was no longer fear. It was protection. It was proof. And more than anything, it was closure. The court had spoken, the bank had honored my directives, and Brian no longer had a key to the life I built. He had burned every bridge with his own hands, and I had finally poured water over the last smoking ember. The first thing I did that morning was call Mr. Anderson to confirm. He answered briskly, already at his desk. He told me the court's order had been filed into the system. Brian's access was formally revoked in every database that mattered. He had no claim left, no way to touch the $120,000 I froze, no power to dip into Sophie and Ethan's college accounts. Mr. Anderson read the last line of the order again so I could hear it out loud. Any further attempt to access these funds will be considered fraud. Hearing that word spoken by the law itself felt like a gavel falling not just in the courtroom, but in my chest. After hanging up, I called the bank manager, a woman whose steady tone had become a comfort. She confirmed what Mr. Anderson said, that every note on every account had been updated, that the alerts were set, and that my signature was the only one the system would recognize. She told me the protective order was scanned into their files and no employee could override it. I thanked her with a voice that finally felt steady. For the first time in a long time, I could breathe. Rachel's fight in the ICU stretched into a year of long days and longer nights. But one morning, 12 months after the worst of it, I walked into her room and she was sitting up with a scarf tied loosely around her head. The hair was coming back in soft tufts, shining in the sunlight. She looked up at me, smiled in that old familiar way, and said, "Dad, I'm hungry." I laughed, I cried, I hugged her carefully, and then I brought her pancakes from the cafe downstairs. Watching her eat was like watching life return in real time. Slowly, month by month, The color returned to her cheeks, her steps grew steady, and one afternoon she picked up Sophie in her arms and spun her in the backyard. I stood there watching, a lump in my throat so heavy it felt like a stone. The house itself, the place Brian had once circled like a vulture, became alive again. Sophie and Ethan ran across the grass, chasing each other with sticks and laughter. Rachel sat in a lawn chair, her hair now brushing her shoulders, smiling in the late Texas sun. I grilled chicken on the back porch and told stories about their grandmother, Linda, how she used to plant roses along the fence line, and how every spring she claimed the pink ones bloomed brighter because of her singing. The children asked me to sing, so I did, and for a moment it felt like Linda's voice was in the wind, carrying mine along. While peace settled over us, Brian's life unraveled. The court denied him custody after reviewing the hospital records, the financial theft, and his absence during Rachel's treatment. The judge's ruling was clear. He had abandoned his obligations and endangered his children's future. News spreads fast in a town when a man is caught spending college funds on yachts and jewelry. Neighbors, who once nodded politely, now crossed the street when they saw him. Old friends stopped answering his calls. He was forced to leave the large rental house when the lease ended and moved into a cramped apartment near the highway, a place where the blinds hung crooked and the paint peeled in strips. I know this not because I checked on him, but because people told me without me asking. A man who once flaunted champagne glasses on a yacht was now seen at the corner bar, drinking beer alone. One afternoon, months after the court order, I received a call from an unknown number. I knew the voice before he said his name. Brian spoke in a tone I had never heard before, low, frayed, desperate. He said he wanted to apologize. He said he had made mistakes. He said he just wanted a chance to see the kids again, that he wanted to explain himself. I listened in silence until he ran out of words. Then I told him plainly, "I don't need your apology. I don't need your excuses. I have my daughter. I have my grandchildren. I have myself. That's all I need." And then I hung up. The line went dead. And with it, whatever thread still bound me to him snapped for good. That night I sat in the living room, the lamp casting its steady circle of light, and I whispered to Linda's picture, "It's over now. He can't touch us anymore." I poured myself a small glass of whiskey and held it up in the quiet room. To Rachel, to Sophie, to Ethan, and to you. The clink of glass against the air was the sound of finality. As the months passed, life began to take on a rhythm I had forgotten. Saturday mornings were for pancakes with the kids. Sunday afternoons were for long walks in the park. I found peace in simple things, oiling the wood on the old rocking chair, fixing the squeak in the porch door, planting new flowers along the fence. I discovered I loved painting, something Linda had always wanted to do. I set up a small easel by the window and painted the oak tree out front, its branches like arms stretching to the sky. I wasn't good, but it didn't matter. Each stroke was freedom. Meanwhile, Brian's spiral deepened. Without steady work, without friends, without the family he had betrayed, he became a shadow in the community. People whispered about him, about the yacht photos that no one could forget, about the court documents that were public record. The story followed him, stamped to his name like ink that would not fade. He called once more, left a voicemail this time, his voice cracking. I deleted it without listening past the first sentence. I had no room left in my life for his regret. Looking back, I realized something sharp and clear. Family is not defined by blood. Family is defined by who shows up when the storm comes, who holds your hand when the floor falls out. Brian had failed at that, but Rachel, despite her silence, had never let go of my hand. And Sophie and Ethan, in their laughter and their hugs, gave me a reason to keep standing. That was family. That was enough. One evening, sitting on the porch as the sky turned orange, I thought about the lessons all this had carved into me. For parents, never hand over blind trust just because love tells you to. Protect yourself because the people you protect need you strong. For children, understand that gratitude is the thread that ties generations together. To cut it is to unravel everything. And for all of us in this modern world, greed wears many faces, but so does justice. If you stand firm, if you keep records, if you hold on to your dignity, justice still has a way of finding its mark. I whispered to myself as the cicadas sang, "I don't need them anymore. I have myself." And it was true. I didn't feel bitter. I felt whole. Whole in a way I hadn't since Linda died. The house eventually became too big for just me. The walls echoed at night, and the stairs felt steeper each season. So I sold it, not in anger, but in peace. $600,000. Enough to secure Rachel's care, enough to build a fund for Sophie and Ethan's college years, enough to give us room to breathe. I bought a modest apartment near the park with wide windows that looked out over a green lawn where kids played soccer in the evenings. It was smaller, simpler, but it was mine. And in that quiet, I felt light. Rachel visited often. The kids filled the space with toys and noise, and I didn't mind stepping over Legos or wiping juice off the table. That was the kind of mess that meant life. I set up my easel by the window again, painted Sophie's curls in the sunlight, and painted Ethan holding a soccer ball. My walls are filled with colors, not shadows. The last call I ever received from Brian came one Sunday afternoon. His voice was hoarse, his words fumbling. He said he had nothing left, that he just wanted to talk. I didn't respond. I blocked the number. That was the final cut of the cord. He would live in the shadow he made for himself. I would live in the light I fought to reclaim. In the spring, I signed up for a local volunteer group, a small organization that delivered meals to seniors who couldn't get out. My first delivery was to a woman named Margaret, 92, with a laugh like church bells. She told me I reminded her of her late husband. I told her she reminded me of Linda. We sat together for a long time, eating soup and sharing silence. I knew then that my next chapter wasn't about battles. It was about giving back. As I left Margaret's house, I paused on the sidewalk and breathed in the cool air. The branches overhead swayed. The children across the street shouted as they chased a ball. My life, once buried in betrayal, now felt rooted in peace. I had learned that self-respect was worth more than any dollar in the bank. And as I walked home, I thought about tomorrow. Maybe I'd plant flowers again. Maybe I'd paint another tree. Maybe I'd sit with Margaret and listen to her stories. All of it sounded good. All of it sounded free. I know now that blood does not guarantee loyalty. Love does, respect does, and truth always does. Tomorrow I will take the first step into this new life, and that will be the beginning of the last, best chapter of all. The first morning in my new place felt almost unreal. The apartment wasn't grand, but it was mine. A modest two-bedroom in a quiet Texas neighborhood, worth about $300,000, with big windows that caught the sunrise and let the light spill across the floor like warm paint. The rooms were smaller than the old house, but the silence was gentler here, no longer filled with echoes of betrayal, but with the hum of possibility. I placed Linda's photograph on the mantel, her smile steady as ever, and for the first time in years, I whispered, "We're safe now." Life quickly found a rhythm. Each morning, I pulled on my boots and went out to the small patch of yard the building allowed me. I planted tomatoes, peppers, and rows of wildflowers that Linda once loved. My hands sank into the soil, rough and cool, and I felt grounded. In the evenings, Rachel would stop by after her treatments, her hair grown back, her laughter stronger. Sophie and Ethan would tumble in with backpacks and drawings, their voices filling the rooms like birdsong. I cooked simple dinners, chili, roast chicken, fried catfish on Fridays, and we ate around a small wooden table that creaked under too many elbows but held steady. Every night after they left, I would sink into my chair with a book or just watch the stars through the window. Peace wasn't something loud or dramatic. It was steady. It was the absence of chaos. It was the knowledge that the accounts were secure, the house sale was done, the law had spoken, and Brian no longer had a hold on us. I kept the red folder in the drawer, but I barely touched it now. It wasn't a shield anymore, just a reminder of a war I had survived. In the community center down the road, I joined a small group that met twice a week. Some were retirees, others widows, a few men my age who had fought their own battles with children, siblings, or business partners. We gathered in a circle, shared coffee and pie, and spoke truths that were hard but healing. One evening I told them, "The greatest wealth isn't in the bank. It's in your character, in the respect you demand for yourself. Without that, money will always find a way to slip through your fingers." Heads nodded. A woman named Carol reached out, touched my hand, and said, "That's exactly right." Brian's shadow lingered at the edges of my life. People told me they saw him sometimes, thinner, worn down, wandering between jobs. He lived in a cramped rental near the highway, the blinds always shut, the paint peeling. Occasionally, emails slipped into my inbox, long apologies filled with excuses. I never replied. I never even read most of them past the first line. My peace depended on silence, and I chose it. The man who had betrayed my daughter, stolen from my grandchildren, and nearly broken me had no place in the world I was building. Still, fate has a way of sending small reminders. One afternoon, a letter came, not from Brian, but from the local school. Sophie had won an award for art, a painting of a tree with branches stretching wide against a sunset sky. They invited me to the ceremony. I put on my best jacket and sat in the front row. When they called her name, she walked proudly across the stage, curls bouncing, smile bright. I clapped until my hands stung. The principal announced that her painting would hang in the town hall for a year. My eyes blurred with tears. That moment was proof enough that the future could be brighter, even if Brian was nowhere to be found. After the ceremony, Sophie ran into my arms. "Grandpa," she whispered, "I drew the tree from your window." I looked at her, at the joy in her eyes, and I realized she had captured not just the tree, but the hope it represented. She had chosen beauty where Brian had chosen greed. I whispered back, "You've given me more than a painting. You've given me tomorrow." That night, sitting on the porch of my apartment, I looked at the sky stretched wide with stars and thought of Linda. "We did it," I said softly. "Rachel is safe, the kids are growing, and the family you loved is standing strong." I felt the wood of the chair beneath me, the same chair I had carried from the old house, its grooves polished by decades of use. It was the last piece of furniture I needed. It reminded me of every battle and every triumph. The lessons etched into me through all this were sharp and clear. For parents, the lesson was simple, but hard. Never hand over all control just because love tells you to. Love is powerful, but without boundaries, it becomes weakness. Protect yourself, not out of selfishness, but out of responsibility, because your children and grandchildren need you to stand firm. For children, the lesson was heavier. Gratitude is the bond that holds families together. To betray that money bond is to trade your soul for dust. Rachel had suffered in silence, but in her heart she had never betrayed me. She trusted me when it mattered most. Brian, on the other hand, had sold trust for champagne bubbles, and he had lost everything that mattered. And for humanity, in this restless modern world, the truth was harsh but necessary. Greed is louder now than ever, flashing on screens, dressed up as ambition. But justice still lives. Dignity still matters. And character. Character outlasts every headline, every bank account, every fleeting thrill. If you hold on to your character, the storms may shake you, but they cannot take you. I reminded myself of this truth one quiet evening when another email arrived. Brian wrote again, begging this time, telling me he had lost his job, that he was lonely, that he wanted forgiveness. I hovered over the screen, my finger close to the reply button. For a brief second, old habits whispered. Then I closed the laptop and said out loud, "I don't need his words. I don't need his apology. I have my life." And I meant it. That moment was the real end of the story. Weeks passed, and the community center became a second home. I volunteered for a food drive, carrying boxes with men half my age and laughing when they teased me about keeping up. I met a retired teacher who taught me to paint better. I learned to cook a new recipe, gumbo that made the kids laugh at how spicy it was. My days are filled not with fear, but with living. One late evening, Rachel sat across from me at the kitchen table. She looked stronger now, her face full of color, her eyes alive again. She took my hand and said, "Dad, you saved us." I squeezed her hand back and replied, "No, Rachel, we saved each other." The next morning, I received another small surprise. A package arrived wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside was an old pocket watch, my father's watch, that I thought I had lost years ago. Someone from the moving company had found it in the back of a drawer and mailed it to me. I sat there, turning it in my hands, listening to its faint ticking. It felt like a message, a reminder of time, of legacy, of the truth that what really matters endures. I set the watch on the table beside Linda's photograph. The three of us, in some way, are still together. As the sun set over Texas that evening, I sat in my chair and whispered once more, "I finally found where I belong." The sky darkened, the stars came out, and I knew with certainty that the story was done. For parents, the message is this: hold your ground, protect what you've earned, and do not let blind love erase your wisdom. For children, the message is sharper. Honor your parents, because gratitude is wealth beyond measure, and betrayal will bankrupt you in ways no bank can fix. And for all of us in this noisy, hurried world, greed can win battles, but dignity always wins the war. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. I didn't need Brian's voice, his shadow, or his regrets. I had Rachel's laughter, Sophie's painting, and Ethan's soccer ball in the hallway. I had myself. And in the end, that was enough. The story has come to an end. I hope it has brought you valuable lessons and insights. If you enjoyed this content, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next video. Goodbye, and see you again.